All right, good afternoon, and welcome to Philosophy 104 class. I apologize, we could not meet last week. There was a mix-up and we did not make enough preparations for the class, so we could not meet. And so today we are moving to a new topic titled fallacies. I don't know if you've heard about fallacies before, but as an undergraduate, I remember then that whenever we start fallacies, it used to be an interesting time on campus because it will trend and everyone will know that we are learning an interesting topic. It's one of the most interesting topics in this course. And you remember when you were taught, I don't know if you were, okay, maybe not your class, but one of the reasons why we study philosophy, especially aspect of logic in philosophy, is to be able to distinguish good reasoning from bad reasoning. And one of the ways that you can distinguish good reasoning from bad reasoning, or good inferences or arguments from bad ones, is the ability to identify fallacies in an argument. And fallacies are broadly divided into formal and informal fallacies. And so we have formal fallacies, which are fallacies that occur within the structure of an argument. You remember when you were introduced to deductive arguments, you were told that what makes an argument valid or invalid is its structure. So when you have an argument that has a defective structure, that argument contains a fallacy and a formal fallacy, and it cannot be valid. The other division of fallacies, they are called informal fallacies. This group of fallacies occur within the context, or the language or assumptions used within an argument, whether oral or written arguments. They occur within the context, content, or language or assumption of that argument. Now, what exactly do we call fallacy? A fallacy is an error in reasoning that makes an argument weak or invalid. It's an error in reasoning that makes an argument weak or invalid. When an arguer puts out an argument, the aim of the arguer is to present a position that his or her audience will address. When there's an error in that argument, or there's something defective in that argument, you cannot achieve that aim of trying to convince your audience, or you convince your audience in error. And that is why it is important to be able to detect fallacies and to learn how to avoid fallacies. And where can we meet fallacies in arguments? I already mentioned that it can be a verbal or written argument. You can meet a fallacy in a definition. You can meet it in a belief. You can meet it in questions. You can meet it in social media posts. You can meet it in political campaigns, in sermons, and so on. And what leads to a fallacy? When there's a poor or wrong connection between your premises and your grounds, between your claims and your conclusion, then there'll most likely be a fallacy in that argument. Another thing that can lead to a fallacy in an argument, if one or more of your premises is false or wrong. When that occurs, you will have a fallacy in that argument. When you use your words, when you're constructing an argument and your words are poorly strung together, you will have a fallacy. You might end up having a fallacy in that argument. Then when you do not interpret the context of your argument properly, you may end up with a fallacy in that argument. And like I mentioned with formal fallacies, when the structure of your argument is poor or weak, you will end up with a fallacy in that argument. And why do we need to study fallacies? You can say, well, What's my business? Why do we need to study fallacies? The major reason why we study fallacies is to be able to identify them in arguments. If you know what a fallacy is, if you can identify a fallacy, then you can easily pick one out in an argument. And why do you want to pick it out in an argument? So that you can avoid them, so as to come up with good reasoning, inferences, and arguments. If you want to come up with good reasoning or inferences or arguments, you must be able to avoid fallacies in your argument. And there's no way you can avoid fallacies if you cannot identify one. Then it also helps us to improve our ability to think critically. If you are able to avoid fallacies, you will most likely be able to, it will most likely improve your ability to think critically. Then you also end up avoiding being misled and also misleading others. You don't accept arguments with errors and you don't present arguments with errors. And so you've avoided being misled, and you're also reducing the possibility of other people being misled. Then it helps you to improve decision making. If you want to make a decision, it is very important that you avoid fallacies in that decision. And so when you have that skill, you can improve your decision making skills. You can also use it to enhance communication. When you can avoid errors in arguments, your communication will be better. Now, I believe that personally, that anyone that wants to learn, has the ability to learn, should study fallacies. But that one is not before us, because it is very important for us to respect and protect the truth. And one of the ways where you can protect and respect the truth is when you avoid fallacies in your arguments. And so to resist deliberate manipulation from arguers, you have to be able to develop intellectual honesty and integrity. And one way of doing that is to understand what we do with fallacies. We can divide fallacies into two broad groups. I think I mentioned this earlier. We have, on the one hand, formal fallacies, and we have, on the other hand, informal fallacies. Formal fallacies occur from errors in the structure of a deductive argument. You know that when you were introduced to deductive arguments, you learned that deductive argument is an argument in which the conclusion is unlikely to be false given the premises, or that the conclusion supports the premises necessarily. And so when you have this, the argument is valid. But when there's an error in the structure of your argument, the argument ends up invalid. And looking at this, you will see that it is important, if you want to construct a deductive argument that is valid, it is important to understand how to make your structures in a way that you will not fall into the error of fallacies. And what are the types of formal fallacies that we have? I will just skim through and mention, because formal fallacies are usually better learned in symbolic logic, in a symbolic class. But since we are using more of language in this class, we will focus more on informal fallacies. But I will still mention the types of formal fallacies that we have for noting, and I'm sure you also get them from your manuals. So the first one, we have the fallacy of affirming the consequence. I'm just mentioning, I won't bother to explain. We have the fallacy, the second one, the fallacy of denying the antecedent. The third one, the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. The fourth one, the fallacy of denying a conjunct. The fifth one, fallacy of four terms. The sixth one, we have bad reason fallacy. The seventh one, we have fallacy of undistributed middle. And the last one, we have existential fallacy. These are some of the common formal fallacies we have. But like I said, we won't explain that in this class. You can go back to your manual if you want to learn more. We will focus more on informal fallacies. And how can we define informal fallacies? Informal fallacies are errors that arise from the content, the context, or language used in an argument. that is an informal error. So when there's an informal fallacy, sorry. So when there's an error that arises from the content, the context, or words used in an argument, you end up having an informal fallacy. And to avoid them, you have to be able to identify those type of informal fallacies. When your argument contains weak or irrelevant premises, you will end up with a fallacious argument, and we do not want that. And that is why we have to teach you the different types of fallacies and give you examples of these fallacies. Now, informal fallacies are broadly divided into different categories. And the first category we'll be looking at today is what we call the fallacies of appeal to irrelevant grounds. That's the first group of fallacies we'll be looking at. And under this group of fallacies, we have about five, is it about five types of we'll get to that. But we have about five types of fallacies of appeal to irrelevant grounds. And what is a fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds, or when does it occur? It occurs when the information in the premises of an argument is not, or they are not relevant to the conclusion of that argument. When you give an argument and your premises are not relevant to the claim of that argument, you have a fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds. That means you're appealing to grounds that are not relevant in that argument. And the first type of fallacies of appeal to irrelevant grounds that we'll look at is called appeal to force. And in Latin, it is called argumentum ad baculum. Appeal to force, also known as argumentum ad baculum. You can get the spelling from your manual. Argumentum ad baculum. And an example of appeal to force is, imagine an employee telling the employer that, well, you ought to promote me. You know, I'm due for promotion. That means that the argument of that employee is promote me, that the claim of the employee is promote me. And then what is the reason for that promotion? And then imagine the employee now saying that, well, I'm not saying you must, I'm just saying I'm due, but I think it would be good for you to do it. Because if you don't, I may need to speak to your wife about what happened between you and Miss Rose during the last convention. Maybe something happened between the boss and Miss Rose during their last company convention. And in this argument, there's no relevance between what happened between Miss Rose and the boss and the promotion of the employee. But the employee is subtly or directly or indirectly appealing to a threat, appealing to force. In other words, I'm threatening you to promote me. If you do not do it, I will have to expose something that you're hiding from your wife. And that is appeal to force, argumentum ad baculum. What you need in an argument is a direct link between your premises and your conclusion, and there is none when you appeal to force. Although the employee might eventually end up getting what he or she wants, but it cannot nullify the fact that the argument is a form of poor reasoning. The second type of fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds, appeal to ignorance. In Latin, it is also called argumentum ad ignorantiam. Argumentum ad ignorantiam. This fallacy occurs when an arguer expects his or her audience to accept a claim or a conclusion or a position because there is no evidence, or there is insufficient evidence that the contrary position is true. For example, if I say that none of you've been able to prove to me that Coke can cause diabetes, that means that Coke doesn't cause diabetes. The fact that people with me at that time cannot prove to me that Coke can cause diabetes does not mean that Coke cannot cause diabetes. So I'm appealing to the ignorance that people there do not know if Coke can cause diabetes, actually cannot argue if Coke can cause diabetes or not without appealing to a fallacy. And I'm saying that because I do not have sufficient evidence that Coke can cause diabetes, therefore I can conclude that Coke cannot cause diabetes. Another example is to say that, well, none of you have been able to prove to me beyond reasonable doubt that God exists. Therefore, God does not exist. The fact that one cannot prove to you beyond reasonable doubt that God does not exist means that you have insufficient evidence. It does not mean that God does not exist. That is another type. So, if you cannot establish a link between your premises, a relevance between your premises and your conclusion, this is also in this case, this is also the case that we have in these examples, and that is an appeal to ignorance, also known as argumentum ad ignorantiam in Latin. The third type of appeal to irrelevant ground is appeal to pity. And in Latin, it is also called argumentum ad misericordiam, appeal to pity. And I think a lot of students use this. Please, sir, I cannot fill that course. I'm the firstborn of my parents. I'm an orphan, and all the financial responsibilities of my siblings are on me. Therefore, I have to pass this course, sir. Please. Although you are appealing to emotions, it is still a poor form of reasoning because there's no relevance between being an orphan and being poor with passing a course. The condition for passing a course in the university is for you to attend classes, do your CA, read, and pass. If you cannot, then you fail. So appealing to pity, when you appeal to pity, there is no link, there's no relevance between that appeal to the claim, and that is a form of fallacy of irrelevant grounds. The fourth type of fallacy of irrelevant ground I'll be looking at is called appeal to authority. And under appeal to authority in Latin is known as argumentum ad verecundiam. Appeal to authority, also known as argumentum ad verecundiam in Latin. And this fallacy occurs when an arguer appeals to a respected person, authority, or appeals to a tradition in order to push a claim forward. You want an audience to accept your position or your argument, and then you appeal to an inexpert authority, or you appeal to a particular tradition to push or to promote your claim or your position. And there are two forms of appeal to authority. The first one is appeal to inexpert authority. And this happens when you say things like, oh, Wole Soyinka said Coca-Cola is the best form of soda in the market. Therefore, Coca-Cola must be the best form of soda in the market. Because Wole Soyinka is a well-known, probably an influential person, you then assume that whatever Wole Soyinka has said must be true. And then you argue based on that. That is an appeal to inexpert authority because Wole Soyinka is not equipped to, or is not an expert in assessing soda. And so there's a fallacy contained in that argument. And it is common with adverts. When people use celebrities, they use influencers to push their products. But when you are now doing this, and you are saying that they must buy, that product must be good because a particular celebrity or influencer has promoted that product, then you are appealing to inexpert authority. That an influencer or celebrity says a product is good does not mean that it is good. Being a celebrity or an influencer does not make one an expert on all fields. The other type of appeal to authority is appeal to tradition. And and this one occurs when an arguer expects an audience to accept a claim because it's a traditional practice. For example, this is how we do it in our family, and therefore that is how you must do it. That is an appeal to tradition. Or when you say that flogging of children is discipline, therefore children must be flogged if you want to discipline them. and your premises or your grounds for saying that is that that is how you were raised, that is how your siblings were raised. Now you're appealing to a popular tradition, but the fact that it is a popular tradition does not mean that it is relevant to the claim. So that is also an example of a fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds. Now, the next type of fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds is appeal to popularity, also known as the bandwagon effect. Fallacy of appeal to popularity, also known as the bandwagon effect. That is, and in Latin is known as argumentium ad populum. Argumentum ad populum. And this fallacy occurs when an arguer wants an audience to accept a claim because many people affirm it. So, because many people like it, therefore it is good. And that is a bandwagon effect. Many OAU students wear jeans, therefore, jeans is the best thing to wear as an OAU student. And you want others to support a claim because it's a popular view. For example, I think during the last election, we had this sweep that people all argued that from top to bottom, just vote Labour Party, because many people I know that is the party voting for the candidates of this party. While it might not be wrong to vote for the candidate of that party, the grounds for saying people should vote is irrelevant to your claim, because there's no relevance between many people pushing a position and that position being right. So that is an appeal to popularity, argumentum ad populum. The next type of fallacy of irrelevant grounds is an appeal to person. And in philosophy, or in Latin, we call that argumentum ad hominem. And argumentum ad hominem occurs when an arguer rejects a position because of the character, the affiliation, or some circumstances that the individual that presents that position finds himself or herself in. Now, there are four types of argumentum ad hominem. That is fallacy of irrelevant grounds, argumentum ad hominem. The first one we'll look at is character assassination. When someone presents an argument, and this is very common on social media, and rather than address the argument, you start insulting the arguer. That is a classic example of fallacy of irrelevant ground, of appeal to irrelevant grounds, abusive ad hominem. For example, someone says that the government should increase its investment in education. That is the claim of that person, and the person gives reasons for why the government should do that. And then another arguer hands up and say, why should we listen to you? Are you not an idiot, foolish person? And it is very common, like I said, in political debates on social media. And that is a very good example of abusive ad hominem character assassination. The character of whether the arguer is an idiot, a bastard, a foolish person or not, is irrelevant to the claim. You attack or you address the argument and not the character of the arguer. The second type of argumentum ad hominem is circumstantial ad hominem. And this occurs when an arguer rejects a claim because of the affiliation or the circumstance of an arguer. Because of the circumstance of an arguer, you then reject an argument. For example, a student presents a proposal that government should introduce free education. And after presenting the proposal, the claim is that government should introduce free education up to probably up to university level, first degree level. And the person gives grounds for this position. And then another person stands up and says, we cannot accept your argument. We cannot accept it because you're a student and you want to benefit from free education. While it might be true that that person as a student will benefit from free education if it is given, it is irrelevant to that argument, to the claim of the arguer, because the person gave a claim and the person gave reasons why the claim should follow. You look at the claim of that argument and you look at the grounds of the argument and decide whether it is acceptable or not, and not to attack the circumstance of the arguer. The third one is what we call what about you? It's called tukokwe. What about you? Tukokwe. That's fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds. Ad hominem, argumentum ad hominem, tukokwe. And this happens when an arguer or an argument or a position is rejected because the arguer is assumed to be guilty of what he or she is presenting. For example, let's look at this example. Peter Obi has condemned the federal government for not allowing the opposition use a venue for rallies. Peter Obi has condemned the federal government for not allowing the opposition use a particular venue for rallies. And he said that it is not good for democracy as it will weaken democracy. And then someone responds and say that, why should we care? Did he not do the same thing as the governor of Anambra State? That is too quick. The fact that the person is guilty of what the person is presenting in that argument does not make the person's argument invalid. So if you want to show that the argument is invalid, you look at the content of the argument and not at the fact that the person is also guilty. So while many people get away with tukokwe, does not invalidate the fact that it is a weak or a poor form of reasoning. Then the fourth type of appeal to person, argumentum ad hominem, is attacking affiliation. It's similar to attacking an arguer circumstance. But while that one is attacking the circumstance, this one is attacking affiliation. For example, if someone says, if someone is defending the school feeding program that goes on in some public schools, and then another person responds, what do you expect him to say? Is he not a member of the APC? Now you have left the argument. Instead of assessing the argument, you are now assessing the affiliation of the arguer, and that is irrelevant to the argument, and that is attacking affiliation. So those are the four types of fallacy of abusive argumentum ad hominem that we have. So let's quickly go through. I'll quickly list the fallacy of irrelevant grounds that we have looked at. That is the first group of fallacies. Fallacies of appeal to irrelevant grounds. The first one is appeal to force, also known as argumentum ad baculum. The second one is appeal to ignorance, known in Latin as argumentum ad ignorantiam. The third one is appeal to pity, argumentum ad misericordiam. The fourth one is appeal to authority, argumentum ad verecundiam. And appeal to authority has two types: appeal to inexpert authority and appeal to tradition. The fifth one is appeal to popularity or bandwagon effect, known in Latin as argumentum ad populum. The sixth one is appeal to person, known as argumentum ad hominem. And argumentum ad hominem has four types: abusive ad hominem or character assassination, excuse me, circumstantial ad hominem, tukokwe or what about you, and attacking affiliation. Okay, there's one more fallacy of irrelevant ground, and that is poisoning the well. That is the seventh type of fallacy of irrelevant ground, called poisoning the well. And it is also a common tactic in politics. Thank you. I don't mind. It's very common in politics. You have a party presents a candidate, and even before the candidate starts presenting his campaign or position or whatever, the opponent has already cast a lot of aspersions on that candidate, to the extent that there is nothing the candidate will say that you will accept. For example, if there's a debate going on, and before the opponent leaves the podium, the opponent will say, well, my opponent is coming up soon. But I want you to remember that he's a habitual liar, he's a friend to bandits, he's corrupt, he has done this and that, and he goes on, telling you several negative things about the person. Now you're already prejudiced to see the person in a wrong light. And no matter what the person says, it is not likely that you listen to the argument of the person. And the reason why you're not listening to the argument of the person is not because the person is not persuasive, it is because of their passions already cast on the character of that person. And that is called poisoning the well. So that's the seventh fallacy of irrelevant ground. So the first group, fallacies of irrelevant ground, I already went through it. We have appeal to force, argumentum ad baculum, appeal to ignorance, argumentum ad ignorantiam, appeal to pity, argumentum ad misericordiam, appeal to authority, and we have two types of that one, appeal to inexpert authority and appeal to tradition. Then we have appeal to popularity, the bandwagon effect, also known as argumentum ad populum. Then we have appeal to person, the argumentum ad hominem, where we have the character assassination, circumstantial ad hominem, tuquoque, attacking affiliation. And the last type of fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds is poisoning the well. So now we move to the second group of fallacies, of informal fallacies. And the second group is fallacies of evidence. And fallacies of evidence are fallacies that occur when an arguer uses wrong or faulty evidence to push an argument. When you want to present an inference or a reasoning, and your evidence or your premises are wrong or faulty, that's a fallacy of evidence. And the first type of fallacy of evidence is one that I like so much. It's called fallacy of false cause. And in Latin, we call it post hoc ego propter hoc. A lot of Yoruba people will be familiar with this example I want to give. The witch cried yesterday. The child died today. Who does not know that it was the cry of the witch yesterday that led to the death of the child today? Àjẹ́ké lánàá, ọmọ kú lénìí, ta ni ò mọ̀ pé kí àjẹ́ àná ló pọmọ jẹ? That is the Yoruba version of the proverb. And now that is a fallacy of false cause, because there is no direct link between the cry of the witch, if that person is actually a witch, and the death of a child. There is nothing connecting both events. But you then assume that it is sufficient evidence and you use it to push an argument. And that is the first type of fallacy of evidence that we are looking at. False cause, also known as post hoc ego propter hoc. The second one is called gambler's fallacy. That's the second type of fallacy of evidence, also known as gambler's fallacy. And this is when an arguer wants to convince an audience to accept a claim because it has happened a lot in the past. Now you want to sell an insurance policy to me, for example, and you told me that about 500 people have benefited from this scheme and so on and so forth. And so because many people have benefited from it in the past, you then assume that it will also benefit me in the present. Or it also happens when someone says, I do know that for the past 20 years, nobody has done this and this and this. That means that this is the right time to do it. So you assume that because something has not happened in the past, the probability that it will happen in the future is high. Or you assume that because something has happened a lot in the past, the probability that it will happen in the future is either low or high. And that is a gambler's fallacy. Betting thrives so much on gambler's fallacy. They tell you that, do you know, for the past 20 years, Man U, if you stake odds on Man U, it will bring you so, 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 and so. And so people will start putting on their money and betting. And that is gambler's fallacy. The third type of fallacy of evidence is what we call begging the question or circular reasoning. And in Latin, we call it petitio principii, circular reasoning or begging the question, and we call it petitio principii. And this occurs when the premises of an argument contains the truth of your claim. For example, if you want to preach to someone and the person asks you that, what is your evidence that God exists? You want to convince the person that God is real. What is your evidence that God is real? And your evidence that God is real is that the Bible says so. Now, you have not succeeded in pushing or in proving beyond reasonable doubt that the claim in the Bible is true, and you're already using it as a grounds for why people should accept your claim. And that means you are using what ought to be proven or what needs a proof in itself as a proof. And that is circular reasoning or begging the question, why do you think God exists? Because the Bible says so. Why did the Bible say that God exists? Because God exists. And so your claim will be the one that you use to buttress your grounds. Your grounds will be the one that you use to buttress your claim. That is a form of circular reasoning or begging the question, also known as petitio principii. The fourth type of fallacy of evidence is what we call fallacy of hasty generalization. And fallacy of hasty generalization occurs when you draw a conclusion from very few examples. For example, you get to where you meet someone at the gate, the person was you. You met a second person, the person was rude to you. You met the third person, the person was rude to you. A fourth person, the person was rude to you. And they conclude that OAU students are rude. I don't even want to know any other thing. OAU students are rude. But out of the thousands of students in OAU, the person actually met just four and should not conclude on that. And so when you have too few examples, and from these too few examples, you generalize or make an argument, you have committed the fallacy of hasty generalization. And it also happens, it occurs a lot when people are talking about race. I have met like four black people, and this is how they behave, this is how white people behave. And meanwhile, out of the millions of white people that you have that exist. Maybe you've only met 1/1 million of them, or even less than that, just a fraction of them. And so your ground is insufficient to make the claim. And that is why it's called the fallacy of hasty generalization. You have generalized in haste. The next one is called fallacy of accident. And fallacy of accident is like it occurs when you make a general rule from a particular case. You then make a general rule from a particular case. For example, when there's this rule that you should not beat the red light, and that maybe in that country the fine for beating the red light is, let's say, $500, and then you see an ambulance that runs the red light, and then you conclude that the ambulance too should be fined $500 because it's also a vehicle and it went past the red lights. Well, it does not, and that rule is not supposed to apply to the ambulance. Another example is when you say that are students in the class, and you say that Alfred is in the class, and because he's a student, you assume that all the students are in the class. It's like you are it, it's like the opposite of of ST generalization. Because students are in the class, you assume that that person is in the class, and that person might not even be there at that moment. The sixth type of fallacy of evidence is slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope fallacy. When someone presents a position, or when you want to present an argument, you say, do you know why we should not vote for this person? If we vote for this person, for example, if you vote for this person, the person has 30 children, and the 30 children they will all have to have security details, and out of this they all have to have their own houses, and then you paint the green picture that of undesirable consequences from one event, and then people say, oh, that should not happen, that should not happen. For example, you argue that building more hostels on campus will increase the number of students on campus and probably increase the occasions of unrest on campus. And if the occasions of unrest on campus is increased, then you now have a case where we have to close schools often, close school down often. And when you close school down often, people will not be able to graduate on time. And if people are not able to graduate on time, they will not be able to get jobs on time. And then you go on. That's a slippery slope fallacy. That one happens does not mean that all the other things that you have mentioned must follow. There's no proof that shows that that action will truly lead to this undesirable consequence, and that is a slippery slope fallacy. The seventh type of fallacy of evidence is fallacy of false dilemma, insufficient options, or false alternatives, and that is very common. For example, someone comes to you and say, you have only two options. It is either you sleep with me or you fail the course. That is a false dilemma. Those are not the two options you have. It is possible you do not sleep with the person and you also pass the course. And so that is a fallacy of false dilemma. Thank you very much. They present two options to you as if they are the only options. And if you are not wise enough to discern a fallacy, you'll be forced to start making a choice based on a false dilemma. So they, out of all possible alternatives, they present only two to you and say it's either you pick A or B. What happened to C, D, E, F, and other options? And so if you are not well versed in identifying fallacies, you assume that these are the only two options available, and you are forced to pick one. So you must be able to say that no, these are not the only options, there are other options. This is a false dilemma. I do not have to accept the options you are giving me. There are so many other options that I can take. And that is the last fallacy of evidence we'll be looking at. So let's quickly run through the types of fallacies of evidence that we have again. The first one is fallacy of false cause, post hoc, ego propter hoc. The second one is gambler's fallacy. The third one is begging the question or circular reasoning, also known as petitio principii. The fourth one is fallacy of hasty generalization. The fifth one is fallacy of accident. The sixth is slippery slope fallacy. And the last one is fallacy of false dilemma or false alternatives. So those are the fallacies of evidence that we have. So let me just take a short break to take some water and then we'll continue. Okay, will you make it? Okay. Let me pack my breath.
Okay, so please take note of this. The assignment that you were asked to do, that is the assignment you were asked to do in your manual, will be submitted through your class reps on Friday within the hours of 9 and 11 a.m. All class reps should collect together and come to submit your assignments. You submit the manuals. Please write name on your manual. Write your name and your matric number on those pages that you answered. Yes, the book itself, write your name on it. Then on the pages that you have answered, write your names on them and your matric number. And then you submit to your class rep. The class rep will submit to the department within the hours of 9 and 11 on Friday morning. Yes, 17th of July. This.
Where they have this? And use extra sheets and stick.
OBJ. Let me get them OBJ. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you very much.
The class is not over. I'm just trying to catch my breath before we continue. So we have looked at two groups of fallacies. The first one, fallacies of appeal to irrelevant grounds, and the second one, fallacies of evidence. So for now, I know you're already thinking of some argument that, oh, this thing that I saw at this particular time, or this thing that this person told me, I can identify this type of fallacy in it. So that is what you are supposed to be able to do after identifying all these fallacies. So I'll just take a few minutes, then we'll continue the class. The class is not over, please. Let me see if we have questions. Okay, no question. Oh, one more. All right, so we can continue with the class now. So let's quickly do something. You can go to the chat box and drop some examples of fallacies. Maybe you write some arguments and you identify the type of fallacy in that argument. For example, you can say that Fair and White, according to Vicky James, Fair and White is the best cream that one can use on a skin, and therefore people should buy it. And then you identify the type of fallacy in that argument. And as you know, the type of fallacy in that argument is appeal to fallacy of appeal to irrelevant grounds, appeal to authority, appeal to inexpert authority. So we are not just looking at fallacy of irrelevant grounds. Is the general name is or the generic name is fallacy of irrelevant grounds. The type is appeal to authority, and the example of that appeal to authority is appeal to inexpert authority. So you can drop some examples so that we can look at them and see that you are really getting the fallacies, and you can identify fallacies or create examples of arguments with fallacies and identify that type of fallacy yourself. Okay, let me give you this example let me give you an example. I'll give you an example. You identify the type of fallacy in that argument. Mm, mm. Mrs. Ojo has argued let me see how I can frame it so that it won't be. Okay, Mrs. Ojo has argued that we should accept the position of the landlord that the rent should be increased. The landlord wants to increase the rent from 30,000 to 50,000 so that he can take care of the septic tank that is giving way and also the pumping machine that is giving us problems. However, we have to be careful before we accept that, because you know that Mrs. Ojo is the landlord's wife's friend. They are very close, and so you should know that you need to be careful before you accept the position of the landlord. What type of fallacy is in that argument? You can just drop it in the chat box and let me see if you are getting it. Please, I typed the. All right, sorry, I was trying to put the question in the chat box, and I'll just quickly repeat the question so that you can put the answer, what you feel the answer is, into the chat box. I wasn't able to type it into the chat box. It was too long for the chat box. So my question is, if you have this type of argument, Mrs. Ojo has argued that we should accept the proposal of the landlord that the rent be increased from 30,000 to 50,000. The landlord has argued that he needs this so that he needs the increase so that he can repair the collapsing septic tank and also fix the pumping machine we've been complaining about. However, we have to be careful about accepting this proposal because Mrs. Ojo and the landlord's wife are best friends. So what type of fallacy is contained in this argument? So you can think about it and drop it in the chat box as we continue the class. So the third group of fallacies that we will look at now, they are called fallacies of ambiguity. They are called fallacies of ambiguity. And fallacies of ambiguity occur when an arguer misuse a word, a phrase, or a statement in an argument. When there's a lack of clarity in your argument, it is likely that that argument will have a fallacy contained in it. And so when your words are not clear, when the use of your words are not clear, when you do not use a phrase appropriately, it is likely you end up with a fallacy of ambiguity. And we have four types of fallacies of ambiguity. The first one is a fallacy of equivocation. That's the first type of fallacy of ambiguity, fallacy of equivocation. And fallacy of equivocation occurs when a word that ought to mean something else is used, that has another meaning, is used to. Okay, I can see an argument here. Good job. Okay, message retracted. Okay, I'll read it when it comes in. And so when a word can have more than one meaning, and you assume that it is probably the word has two meanings, meaning A and meaning B, and you assume that that argument is using it in the B sense, then you end up with the fallacy of equivocation. For example, you have death is the perfection of life. That is an example because death is the end of life. And the end of a thing is its perfection. I'll take that again. Death is the perfection of life because death is the end of life. And the end of a thing is its perfection. And the term end in this argument is used equivocally. And in its first occurrence, you have used it twice. In the first occurrence, it means a final event. In the second occurrence, it means purpose. They do not have the same meaning. Although end, that word end is the same, but in the context of that argument, they do not have the same meaning. And so when you end up using the same meaning in the same argument, you end up with a fallacy of equivocation. You end up with a fallacy of equivocation. And when you use a word that can be understood in more than one way, you will need to clarify how you are using that word. Otherwise, you end up with a fallacy of equivocation. And that's the first type of the fallacy of ambiguity that we are looking at. Another example of fallacy of ambiguity is if someone says that only men are rational or men are rational beings, the person is using men here to mean human beings. And someone says, women are not men, therefore women are not rational beings. And it's sometimes people use it hilariously. For example, in the Bible, where they said that the heart of man is desperately wicked, and you see some women joking with it that, well, the Bible says the heart of man is desperately wicked, not woman. But in that case, the Bible is using man in the generic sense of it being a human being, and not just referring to the gender man. It's referring to the human being. And so when you take the word man to mean just men and not human beings, you will fall into the fallacy of ambiguity, fallacy of equivocation. The second type of fallacy of ambiguity is fallacy of composition. And fallacy of composition occurs when you argue that because a whole set or because a whole class of objects or class of people lacks a property or attributes, that means that the whole group lacks that property. And it is very common in football banter. You hear something that, um, Arsenal is a shitty club. You hear Arsenal is a shitty club, and then therefore Declan Rice must be a shitty player. If Arsenal is a shitty club, Declan Rice must be a shitty player. Or you hear something like, because Arsenal won the Premier League, therefore all Arsenal players are excellent players. The argument might not follow. Because a group lacks a characteristic or has a characteristic it does not mean that all the parts of that group must have that characteristic or must lack that characteristic. For example, if I say that black people are very nice, black people are nice, it does not follow that every black person you see must be nice, and it must not follow that every black person you see is not nice. But you cannot just argue that because a set has a property or lacks a property, then all members has a property. It does not follow like that. For example, I say the soup is sweet, and because the soup is sweet, I assume that the maggi is sweet, the salt is sweet, the meat inside is sweet, and I go on and on and on like that. And another example is when you say that water is made up of H2O. Water is made up, and you mention the composition of water, and then you now want to argue that whatever water has, what makes up water must also have what water has. And that is a fallacy of composition. The fallacy of division, that is also a fallacy of ambiguity. It occurs when we argue that because a part of a group has a characteristic, then the whole set must have that characteristic. Because a part has a characteristic, the whole set must have it. And this usually occurs when it's very common in tribalism. You feel that because you have met some people from a particular tribe, let's say you have met three Yoruba people, and or you've met one Yoruba person, and you know something that is unpleasant or pleasant about that Yoruba person, you then assume that every Yoruba person must have it. Yoruba people are nice because you see that my roommate, Ronke is such a nice girl. Therefore, Yoruba people are nice. So you're assuming that because she's Yoruba, every other Yoruba person you see must have that property. And it does not follow when you say Yoruba people have tribal marks, because tribal marks are probably synonymous to that tribe. You then assume that every member of that tribe must have tribal marks. That is a fallacy of division. So we've identified fallacies of ambiguity. We've identified three types of fallacies under the fallacy of ambiguity so far. We have the fallacy of equivocation that argues that because a whole has a characteristic, you then argue, and we have the fallacy of equivocation, sorry, that uses the same word in different ways and assume that that word, when a word can mean more than one thing, and then you use it in a way where you interchange one meaning for the other. That's a fallacy of equivocation. The other one is the fallacy of composition, where you assume that because a set has a property, then every member of that set must have that property or attributes. Then we have the fallacy of division. And fallacy of division assumes that because a particular set or because an individual in a particular set has a characteristic, then every other part of that set must have that characteristic. Then the fourth type of fallacy of ambiguity is called fallacy of amphiboly. And fallacy of amphiboly occurs when you use your grammar wrongly, when you use a word wrongly, or there's a punctuation error, or there's a reckless placement of words in a statement that leads to ambiguity. And then because you have missed maybe one comma or one full stop or one semicolon in a place, you then end up with an ambiguous argument. For example, we say that women, let me look for an example. We say that a fashionable office chair suitable for young executive with soft backside and bucket seat. Let's eat grammar. Women without a man is useless. And now this is a sentence that should have comma, but because there's no comma in it, it is likely that you end up with ambiguities in that argument. And so sometimes when you're supposed to put a comma somewhere and that comma is not there, or you're supposed to put a full stop somewhere and the full stop is not there, and then because of the absence of that punctuation mark, your argument can be read in another way. That's a fallacy of amphiboly. You said Ibrahim Olamilekan said that he has deleted it. Okay, let's go on. So when you have something like that, you end up with a fallacy of amphiboly, or you use grammar wrongly, you end up with a fallacy of amphiboly. So those are the four types of fallacies of ambiguity that we have: fallacy of equivocation, fallacy of composition, fallacy of division, and fallacy of amphiboly. I will give us some time. Okay, circumstantial ad hominem. And what type of argue or fallacy is circumstantial ad hominem? You must remember to have that it's a fallacy of irrelevant grounds, circumstantial ad hominem. Thank you, Mushebolaton, you are correct. But you have to add that it's also a fallacy of irrelevant grounds. Yes, you are correct. Olaofe, Oluwa Olajumoke. Yes, you are correct. And yes, under the fallacies of irrelevant ground, you are correct, Ibrahim. Very correct. You are correct. Any other attempts before we move forward? Any other attempts? And you can also come up with examples. Tell me the fallacy in that example, and I will check if you are right or wrong. So for fallacy of amphiboly, like I said, when your grammatical structure is ambiguous in that argument, you end up with a fallacy of ambiguity, amphiboly. And that is because your argument ends up being interpretable in more than one way. And when that happens, yes, okay, that's correct, Brian. And when that happens, what you have will be an ambiguous, your argument will be misleading. So you have to be, when you write out an argument, you have to make sure that all your punctuations are in place. You have to make sure that your words are properly used and you're not making any grammatical error, because any mistake can make your argument be understood in another way. And when your argument is understood in another way and the error did not come from the person interpreting your argument but from the way you constructed that argument, then it's a fallacy of amphiboly under fallacy of ambiguity. So I'll take a short break. You can drop your questions or examples, and then we'll continue with the class. Okay, someone asked the question, what's the difference between fallacy of composition and fallacy of division? Now, fallacy of composition occurs when something is true of a set, when a whole set has a property or a whole group has a property, and you think that because the group has the property, then every part of that group must have the property. For example, if I say Arsenal is a fantastic team, and because Arsenal is a fantastic team, I then assume that it follows that every member of that team must be a fantastic player. No, it does not follow like that. That is the fallacy of composition. You move from the whole to the part. And then fallacy of division. Fallacy of division occurs when something is true of the parts of a group. Maybe you have a team and the 11 members of that team are good players. You know, it does not follow that those good players can work together to form a good team. So the fact that they are good players does not mean that they can form a good team. So what is true of the parts might not be true of the whole. And that is the difference between composition and division. Composition, what is true of the whole might not be true of the parts, and division, what is true of the parts might not be true of the whole. That is the difference. Another person asked if an argument or a claim can be subject to multiple fallacy. Oh, yes. And I think I should have mentioned that you can have more than one fallacy in an argument, as many as possible. And once you can identify fallacies, you'll be able to pick out if you have more than one fallacy in an argument or not. Yes, you can have multiple fallacies in an argument. Then concerning the assignments, it will be good to let me know if I answered your question well so that I will know that I have addressed it sufficiently. Then concerning the assignment, are we to answer the section B part or just the objective questions? Only the objective questions. So you have to answer only the objective questions. I hope you got that. You have to answer only the objective questions. Ensure you put your name on the page where you answer the objective question and your matric number. Your name and your matric number must be there. And then even on your manual, ensure you put your name and matric number on it so that when they are returning it, you can easily identify yours and you submit through your class rep only the objective questions, and you are submitting the whole manual which will be returned to you later on. So I hope I answered that question properly. So now we move to another group of fallacies. And this group of fallacies is called the fallacies of unwarranted assumptions. Fallacies of unwarranted assumptions. And fallacies of unwarranted assumption happen when an arguer rely on premises that are themselves yet to be justified or require further justifications. Now, when your premises itself still requires some justification, you cannot use it to justify your conclusion. And so when that happens, you have a fallacy of unwarranted assumption. The first, and we have three types of fallacy of unwarranted assumption. The first one is moralistic fallacy, also known as fallacy of moralism. And this kind of fallacy occurs when what ought to be, you assume that what ought to be is the case. For example, when I say that, hmm, let me look for a relatable argument. All right, so because we believe that something ought to be true, we believe that something ought to be true, we then say that that is the case. Something ought to be true, then it is the case. For example, someone can say that men and women are unequal because so, 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 and so. And because the person feels that that is what should obtain, the person then feels that therefore, that is what is the case. What is different from what ought to be. So even if it is what ought to be, you should mention it and you should not use it as the basis for your argument. That is a moralistic fallacy. And when you derive an is from an ought, that means that you think that what ought to be is what is. Maybe this is how things should be. You then argue that that is how things are. It might be how things should be, but does not follow that that is how things are at the moment. The second type of fallacy of unwarranted assumption is naturalistic fallacy, and it's the converse of the moralistic fallacy. When you claim that because something is true, and then therefore it is natural, because something is natural or unnatural, then it is true. For example, a lot of people, and it happens, it is very common with this argument on the rights of homosexuals. And the argument that most people have is that because homosexuality is not natural, that biologically humans are wired not to be attracted to the same gender. And because that is the case, then it follows that homosexuality is wrong. That means because it is not natural, therefore it is wrong. And we have some religious people that also hold that view. They will tell you that because CS is not the natural way to give birth, therefore it is the wrong way to give birth. And you see people that also say that IVF is not the natural way to conceive, therefore it is the wrong way to conceive. So because it is not natural, then it is not good. Or when you assume that because something is natural, then it is good. I remember there was a time my uncle, when he was living with us, he had malaria. And my father already gave him drugs that he used. But because someone told him that natural herbs is the best, he already took some drugs, some tablets, because someone told him that natural herbs is the best, because it is natural, therefore it is best, it is the best. He went outside and he went to take some leaves which he boiled, and it was only God that saved him that day. He had to be rushed to the hospital. So because something is natural does not mean that it is acceptable, and because it is not natural does not mean that it is unacceptable. You have to give evidence that that thing is natural, or that that thing is good, is acceptable or not acceptable, not based on whether it is natural or not. We have people that will say that abortion is wrong, is morally wrong, because it is against natural order. We have people that argue that even contraceptives are wrong because it interferes with the natural order. And these are naturalistic fallacies. when you argue like this, it is naturalistic fallacies. You see some people that use Indian hemp, and they will tell you that it is nature. I've seen someone like that. It is nature. It is just grass, natural grass, and it can't harm us. God has put it there for us to be able to use them. And because it is natural, it comes from nature, therefore it is good. And while I'm not saying it is bad, I'm saying that it is a faulty way, or there's an error in that line of reasoning. You have to give us reasons why it is good beyond the claim that it is natural, or beyond the assumption that it is natural or natural. The next type of fallacy of unwarranted assumption is a very interesting type. We call it the fallacy of loaded question. And I will give you an example. You are in court, and the lawyer on the other side walks up to you and say, okay, when was the last time you beat your wife? Now, this is not just a question. The person is not just saying that. The person is not asking you if you beat your wife or not. The person is saying you beat your wife, you have done it more than once, and there must be a last time that you did it before that time. Or did you beat your wife this morning? When they ask you such a question, it's a loaded question. And as someone that has studied fallacies, you should know that it is a trap question and you're not supposed to answer that type of question. So if you are able to identify fallacies, you can tell the lawyer that I cannot answer that question because it's a loaded question. What exactly do you want to know? If you want to know if I beat my wife or not, you ask me directly if I beat my wife, and I will tell you if I do. Now, if you cannot identify loaded questions, you might end up by arguing with the person asking you questions, and you fall into the trap that the person has set for you. Another example of loaded question. There was this celebrity that someone was interviewing one time, and the person asked her, "Have you stopped smoking?" And she flared up because it's a loaded question. She said, have you seen me smoke before? So why should you ask me that type of question? So if you say, have you stopped smoking? And she says, oh, well, yes, that means she has accepted that she used to smoke. And so it is important to be able to identify loaded question. When you are able to identify loaded question, you can avoid the trap that the arguer is trying to set for you. So we have three types of fallacies of unwarranted assumption. We have the moralistic fallacy, that says that you cannot conclude that because something ought to be, then it is the case. Because um, something ought to be, then it is already the case. Yes. Then we have the naturalistic fallacy. You argue that because something is natural, then it is acceptable, or you argue that because something is not natural, then it is not acceptable. That is naturalistic fallacy. And the third one is the fallacy of loaded question. When someone presents a question as if it's an innocent question, but actually it has more than one assumption or more than one question loaded in it. There are a lot of assumptions packed into that question. And if you cannot identify loaded question, you might fall into the trap that the person is setting for you. Imagine if someone asks, have you stopped cheating during the exam? And you say, yes. And maybe at the back of your mind, you are thinking, but I've never cheated before. So instead of just saying yes, the correct question should be, sir, that's a loaded question. You're assuming that I cheat, and I cannot answer that question because I do not cheat. So if you can identify loaded question, you'll not fall into that type of trap when people bring it before you. Okay, Tawo Jaye, you're saying a test and CBT or written ma, it will be CBT. The assignment is in your manual, but other ways of assessing you will be through CBT, not written, through CBT. And so we have looked at fallacies of unwarranted assumption, and then we move to the next group of fallacies, the fallacies of diversion. And the fallacies of diversion occur when the arguer is trying to distract the attention of the audience from the subject matter or the major um, subject matter of an argument. When the arguer sees that he or she is about to lose an argument or does not have enough grounds to support the claim, then the arguer, well skilled enough, can start looking for how to divert the attention of the arguer from of the audience from the argument. For example, the first type of, we have how many types of fallacies of diversion? We have four types of fallacies of diversion. The first one is the red herring fallacy. And this fallacy is committed when an arguer stylishly introduces an issue that is not directly related to the argument before to change the topic. And if you are not careful enough, you take debates, you drop the main argument, and you start pursuing the distraction that the author has set for, the arguer has set for you. I'll take that again. When an argument is going on and the arguer sees that he or she does not have enough grounds to continue with the line of that subject matter, the person will just throw in another issue. And that issue can distract you from the main argument. And then you leave the main argument and concentrate on the new issue that the person has thrown at you. And you change the argument completely. And you are unaware. You are not even aware that the subject matter has changed. And then you continue like that. And one example is probably arguing that Ronaldo is better than Messi, and then you argue back and forth, and one party sees that he or she is losing and quickly throws in a bit and say, "But do you think a 41-year-old player is still fit?" And then you leave the debate between Messi and Ronaldo and move into whether 41-year-old footballers are still fit, and you lose the argument completely. The person has thrown a distraction at you, and you have grabbed that distraction, and you have forgotten the subject matter of your argument, and you have moved to another thing. And this fallacy, when a dog, for example, you see, let me give you a practical example. A dog is chasing someone, and the dog is about to catch that person. Another person comes and throws suya along the path of that dog. What do you think the dog will do? The dog will leave the person it's chasing and go after the suya. That's what an arguer does with red herring. It looks for another subject matter that he has more skill in winning and use it to distract the actual subject matter and change the subject matter of the argument. And before you know it, you are looking at something else and not the actual argument on ground. For example, let's look at this argument between Alfred and Mary. Alfred says, the Bible teaches Christians to be people of peace and love. And Mary says that is not true. Christians are expected to be violent. Isn't it recorded in the Bible that the kingdom of God suffers violence and the violent takes it by force? And then Alfred says, but Christianity brought civilization to many parts of the world. And then Mary takes the bait and starts talking about whether Christianity brought civilization to many parts of the world or not. Now, Mary has forgotten that what they are saying is the major argument is whether Christianity is peaceful or violent, and it has shifted into how Christianity brought civilization to many parts of the world. So that's the fallacy of red herring under fallacy of diversion. The second type of fallacy of diversion is straw man fallacy. And straw man fallacy is committed when, in attempting to refute an argument, the original argument is abandoned and replaced with something that looks like that argument. In red herring, it's a different argument entirely that the person brings up. But in a straw man, the arguer brings up an argument that looks like the original argument, but is entirely different. It's a weaker form of the original argument, and you will be forced to accept that weaker form. The arguer knows what he or she is doing. For example, someone might argue that given the availability of an abundance of wealth in Nigeria, Nigerian education sector should be subsidized. Another person says that position is unjustifiable. Free education cannot be sustained by the nation's financial strength. Now, this person is talking about how the education sector should be subsidized. He's not talking about free education. He's talking about subsidy. But the other person has changed it into a weaker argument. Free education cannot be sustained by the nation's financial strength. And it is easier to lose the argument that free education cannot be sustained by the nation's financial strength than to lose the argument that the educational sector should be subsidized. And the arguer is aware. So the arguer presents another argument that looks similar to the original argument, but is a major departure from the original argument. And if you are not skilled in identifying fallacies, you will just make the mistake of flowing with the arguer and you abandon the original argument. The third type of fallacy of diversion is fallacy of edging. And this occurs when the arguer has presented his or her argument. And because the arguer wants to force the claim on the audience, the arguer starts shifting or modifying the already presented claims. The person starts changing it. You say, for example, and because you are probably are seeing some weakness in that argument, and the person starts changing the arguments. For example, someone says Henry is a totally selfish man, and the audience replies that, well, I don't find him so. He has helped me with a job before. And the other person says, well, when it comes to things that affect his wallet, he's totally selfish. The person already said he's a totally selfish man, because the audience says that no, he has helped me find a job before. If he's selfish, he won't help me find a job. He has now shifted the argument a bit to when it comes to things that affect his wallet, he's totally selfish. Then that person replies again, well, but Henry has loaned me money on many occasions. He has loaned some friends, so he has even given us free money. And the person says that, well, when it is about his own personal money, maybe he's giving, he can give you loan, but he cannot give you free money. He's selfish when it comes to giving free money. And so the person keeps shifting the argument so that it will be difficult for the audience to counter the claim, start shifting the grounds, shifting the argument to the extent that the person will just eventually probably have to accept to the edging in order to avoid objections raised against the argument. Then the last type of fallacy of exception of the diversion that we'll be looking at is exception that proves the rule. Exception that proves the rule. And the fallacy of exception that proves the rule occurs when a person argues that the exception to a particular generalization is possible. The exception is possible. For example, someone says law students are brilliant because they always score high grades in their exams, and the audience replies that that is not correct. A law student scored low grades in all the courses he took last semester. And the person replies that John's case is an exception that proves the rule. That exception does not prove the rule. The exception shows that your generalization is weaker and it does not prove the rule. So that is a mistake when you are saying that the generalization itself is plausible. That is exception that proves the rule. And now the fallacies of diversion, I've mentioned four types. The red herring, when someone brings a totally different argument to distract you from the main one. more difficult to defeat that person. And then the generalization is weak, or there's an exception to a generalization, the person tries to use it to prove that the generalization is okay. And so, while we may not be able to always detect fallacies, but this will help you to, these are some of the things you can do to reduce committing fallacies in your arguments. The first one is to clarify your definitions. You identify your grounds and your conclusions clearly. You ensure that your premises are relevant to your grounds, and you ensure that your premises are relevant to your claim, sorry, and you ensure that your claim follows from your grounds. And then you ensure that you are not employing emotional manipulation or tricks in your argument. You also demand sufficient evidence or supply sufficient evidence, and you also give room for alternative explanations. You do not have to win an argument all the time. If you try to win an argument all the time, it is very likely that you end up committing a lot of fallacies. So I will now quickly go through all the fallacies we have looked at. We looked at two divisions of fallacies. We have formal fallacies, informal fallacies. Formal fallacies occur within the structure of an argument, while informal fallacies occur within the context, the content and language used in an argument. And then we have groups of fallacies. The first group of fallacies is the fallacies of appeal to irrelevant grounds. And the first type under that is appeal to force, argumentum ad baculum, appeal to ignorance, argumentum ad ignorantiam. The third one is appeal to pity, argumentum ad misericordiam. The fourth one is appeal to authority, argumentum ad verecundiam. And argumentum ad verecundiam has two types: appeal to inexpert authority and appeal to tradition. Then we have the fifth one, appeal to popularity or the bandwagon effect. That is argumentum ad populum. We have the appeal to person, argumentum ad hominem. And under argumentum ad hominem, we have character assassination, 1, circumstantial ad hominem, 2, tuquoque, 3, attacking affiliation, 4. And the last type of fallacy of irrelevant ground is poisoning the well. Then under fallacies of evidence, we have fallacies of false cause, post hoc ego propter hoc. We have the gambler's fallacy, that's the second one. The third one is begging the question or circular reasoning, also known as petitio principii. We have the fallacy of hasty generalization. We have the fallacy of accidents. We have the slippery slope fallacy, and we have the fallacy of false dilemma. Then the next group, the third group, is the fallacies of ambiguity. Under the fallacies of ambiguity, we have the fallacy of equivocation, we have the fallacy of composition, we have the fallacy of division, we have the fallacy of amphiboly. And under fallacies of unwarranted assumptions, we have the moralistic fallacy or fallacy of moralism. We have the second one is naturalistic fallacy. The third one is the fallacy of loaded question. Then we have the fallacies of diversion. Under that, we have red herring. The second one is straw man. The third one is fallacy of edging. And the fourth one is exception that proves the rule. So that brings us to the end of the teaching for today. But I'll wait for some few minutes. If you have questions, you can drop the questions and I'll attend to them. Thank you. All right, if you do not have questions, we can end the class now, or we can compile our questions and bring them to the next class, which will also be our last class. So thank you. See you next week. Bye.
Good afternoon, class. And welcome to LIB 001. And before we go to the class, I would like to let you know some things about the course. Today we should be having module 11 today out of 13 modules. Meaning we have taken, after today's class, we'll have taken 11 modules. We'll just be left with 2 more classes to go. And from the look of things, many of you have missed the classes. For you to catch up, you may need to read some other materials, especially there's a book in the library called the book of readings. I mean, you find the book in the bookshop. So get yourself a copy. It covers all the modules. So you may decide to, we just encourage you to buy the book, go through it. It covers all the modules that we have for the course. So get the material and make sure you read for the exam. Then you can remember we said the CA, you will need to come to the library for library tour. The library tour is part of your CA, and at the same time there is going to be a test that shows that library tour and the test will form the CA for the course. Then some of you might have come for library tour, but for those of you that have not visited the library, your course rep will have to go to the library, meet with the lecturer so that a time can be fixed for the library tour. It is very, very important. The library tour carries 10 marks. So, and it's part of the continuous assessment. You need to do that. Let the course rep visit the library. Then from there, you meet the lecturer so that a convenient time can be fixed for you to have the library tour. And I would like to announce to you that for the test, a date has been fixed for a general test. So that test will come up on the 24th of July between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. So the test is coming. That means you have to get ready for the test. So tell others, let them know that there is going to be a general test. General test that will form part of the continuous assessment. Then in view of that, the course representatives will have to meet the lecturers because they have to submit to the lecturer the list of the class members. The list of the class members in an Excel format. That is, the information that will be recorded or that will be on the list will include the names of the students, the matric number, and their OAU email address. So we need that, we need that in order to set the Google Meet or whatever we are going to use for the test. So I've given you the information now. Tell the course reps to visit the library with a list of their class members. And that list will be prepared in Excel format, bearing the names, the matric number, email addresses of the students, and that has to be submitted on or before Friday this week. So the list we have to get to the individual lecturers on or before Friday this week. Take note of that. And by now you should have known your group. You should have known your group, and you should have known your lecturer. So for those of you that don't know your group yet, visit the library. It is pasted in the library. So your group and the lecturer that will be in charge of the group is they are all pasted in the library. So you need to visit the library to know your group, to know your lecturer. And like I've said, let your course representative meet the lecturer so that there will be an appropriate time for you to fix an appropriate time for the library tour. The library tour is very, very important, as well as the general test. The two together will form your continuous assessment. So today we'll be having module 11. So the lecturer for the module will come over now. So enjoy the class.
Okay, sure. Once again, good afternoon, everyone, and you are welcome to today's class, tagged module 11. The title is Multimedia Use in the Library. Multimedia use in the library. So the only important word there is multimedia. So we need to know what multimedia is. So when we say multimedia, we are talking about the integration of the different means of expression in a document such that you will have texts, images, videos, animation, interactivities of all sorts in the same document. And the aim, of course, is to communicate better, is for the listener to understand the speaker better than it would have been without multimedia, without the use of multimedia. So in a nutshell, that is just what multimedia, from multiple media, many mediums. Let's put it that way. So from multimedia, so that's the meaning. So once we understand that, it should be easy to navigate through the rest of the class. By standard definitions, there are all kinds of definitions, but we can state some of them here. The multimedia is information which has been digitized from various sources such as text, graphics, audio, video, music, pictures, etc., and recorded on a computer where it can be manipulated and recombined. So the whole essence is to put many things together in one to facilitate clearer understanding. So that's just the essence of what we looked at. So it effectively informs and educates using persuasive strategies with enhanced effects of color, animation, and sound. So that is what so for someone listening or for someone viewing, it will add some kind of color, some kind of uh, um, information that may otherwise not be available. So that's the essence of that. The components of multimedia usually include texts, which have been mentioned in text. The purpose of text there is for clarity and for self-pacing. You want to go back to it, you want to see it again, and all of that. So that's the essence of text there. Then it contains audio. Audio, of course, impacts the mood and the character. And then, of course, it will contain graphics for visualization and communication style. Animation, of course, is part of it. Animation is one of the components. Animation for this simulation of motion in static drawings, for example, and video to capture the motion of real life events. So it's just for that, you want to capture things in real life, you need the video version. So basically, that's what multimedia is about. We have two basic types of multimedia now. So we have two basic types. We have the interactive multimedia and the non-interactive multimedia. The interactive one is where you can interact with the media. You can say, this is where I want to start from. This is not where I want to start from. I want to skip this for now, and all of that. You can do that. You can say that in the interactive media, but that's not possible in the non-interactive media. So the interactive media specifically supports individual use and individual learning. It is the interactive one is all about the individual or the learner himself. So you want to say, okay, I am the one who wants to learn, and I want to learn at my convenience. I want to learn at my pace, and all of that. You are free to choose. You are free to go your pace. So it supports the use, individual use, and then individual learning. In the interactive multimedia mode, the learner chooses what he wants to learn as he navigates the multimedia system. Interactive multimedia is applied to an active audience, just as the name implies. So it's an active on the audience, someone there, someone right there, someone engaging the media, and all of that. So that's the interactive type. So examples are like your video games, the medical simulation, educational software, websites, gaming, all that, those are the examples of your interactive multimedia. Then, of course, the non-interactive multimedia majorly applies to a static or passive audience. So you are talking about a passive audience. There, in the non-interactive media, you are not expected to interact. You are only expected to watch on, look on, listen, until the end of the class. So that is the multimedia. For example, during scholarly presentations, just like your seminars in the department, the presenter presents in multimedia format, while the audience simply receives information or the information presented. So you just listen to what is being presented. You can't interfere. You can't interact. At the moment the seminar is being delivered. So of course you can ask for questions later, but while it is being delivered, you can't interact. So that's why it is non-interactive. So you have that. So that leads us to the use of multimedia in the library. For innovative service delivery in the library, of course, we need to engage multimedia, and that is the essence of the primary or the whole essence of multimedia media anywhere. So the library too employs it for service delivery, effective service delivery. So, but it depends on what the library wants to use it for. For example, the library use it for publicity or as marketing strategy to market library services or library products, and so on. So multimedia packages could be used as an interactive form of publicity or marketing strategy for library services. So that's important. The use of a combination of various media components is a more attractive form of publicity or more attractive form of a publicity strategy, and that will captivate the senses better than using only one single medium, such as your text. So that's one way we employ multimedia in the library. Then in another way, we can use it for selective dissemination of information that we usually refer to as SDI in information. So we use it for, if you have specific information for specific people or for specific audience, you apply that, and for instance, if you want to teach or to get information across to the visually or hearing impaired set of people, you can employ SDI to do that effectively. So that's the essence of SDI anyway. So an instance of that is where you have a software. Of course, there is a software, multimedia software, which helps visually impaired learners to learn mathematics and other subjects through utilization of sound and touch. Still about the library, but here the next thing I want to discuss is about the advantages that has when it is employed in the library, the advantages it has, advantages of multimedia, their application in or use in the library. Of course, it has its own advantages. It makes learning more interesting. That is exactly the point anyway. It makes learning more interesting anytime, anywhere. It makes information more interesting, and so on, and so on. So with a multimedia approach to information provision, learning becomes more interesting. Learning will become more interesting. Just as we always love, you want to see, what's going on, you want to hear what's going on at the same time. Okay, you want to visualize, you want to, put yourself in the picture of what's going on, and so multimedia becomes essential that way. Provision of information in multimedia formats asserts the position of the library as the information hub in any knowledge-based community. So, of course, the library is there as the knowledge base of the community. And of course, to prove that the library knows his stuff, multimedia is essential for delivering library services. So from there, we move on to application of multimedia in education in general. This is not just the library, but in education in general. The application of multimedia in education in contemporary times is the norm rather than the exception. We all know that. So it is the norm now. Multimedia everywhere, in whatever we do, even in education. It makes learning more comfortable, more interesting, and more results oriented. So we apply it generally in education. The learning environment varies, as you all know. So the learning environment varies considerably. So the learning environment could be physical, the physical classroom, could be the virtual learning environment, could be the distance one, could be the on-site one, could be online one, could be anything. So you can have that. But the hallmark of multimedia applications in education involves interactive learning, which is more engaging when compared to traditional methods of chalk, talk, and the blackboard, which is teacher-centered rather than learner-centered. Of course, we are all familiar one way or the other with the chalk, talk, and blackboard scenario. And so where the teacher is all the focus, all the attention. So all the learners' attention is fixed on the teacher as the teacher teaches on. So it's fixed on the teacher and the blackboard. But in the interactive mode, it is different. It is different. It is the interactive mode is more learner-centered than the teacher-centered. If you look at the bottom of that page, you will see some of the gadgets we are referring to, the TV, the mic, and all of that. All of that put together, combined neatly, professionally, will give you what we are talking about. Will give you multimedia. We can't overstate the importance in education, of course. Using multimedia, for example, in education encourages interactive learning, which is achieved through live action video. The interactive learning is achieved through live action video, feedback, questions, and answers to keep the learners focused. So you are free to do all of that. You see, you watch, you ask, your questions are and so on and so on. And the focus is on the learner, not on the teacher. Focus is on the learner, not on the teacher. For example, in learning of practical skills, such as the ones in agriculture, in biology, home economics, you can understand multimedia use creates an enabling environment through the application of simulation. So there's this application of simulation where you can see things that you can't really have in real life, but you can see them, through the multimedia. You can see them as if they are real. That is the essence of simulation. In simulation, real life processes are artificially created in order to improve understanding and the application of practical skills. So the what you cannot see physically is simulated for you so that you can visualize it, you can see it as if it is the real life. Essentially, multimedia applications in education allows for self-paced learning, taking cognizance of the fact that individual learners learn at different paces and enables capacity for interactive. So the point here is that not everybody learns the same pace. Not everybody learns the same way. So, and if it is learner-centered, then it gives you the opportunity to learn at your own pace, to learn sometimes in your own way, and so on. So that's the essence of that. So just as we've been saying, traditionally, we all understand learning is teacher-centered, okay? And it is focused on learning by memorization. But the multimedia scene presents a completely different experience. So you have a completely different experience in the multimedia mode. So learning in the multimedia mode is interactive, and the environment could either be a physical classroom or virtual environment, combining text, video, sound, graphics, animation, and so on together in the class. So educational simulation, as we said before, educational simulation provides the learner an opportunity for exploring, for experimenting, and for interacting. So you have the opportunity, just as we have been saying, that it is learner-centered. So you have the opportunity to explore. You can explore, you can experiment, you can interact your own way by yourself. Some experiments students may not directly in biology, in chemistry, in physics, and other technical subjects due to unavailability of funds, of equipment, of facilities, can be taught just as effectively as in the laboratory using simulation multimedia learning software. So it will look as if you are in the laboratory in that context. So it's the same thing as, because what you should have seen in real life has been simulated for you there. So there is an innovation in learning sciences that we call the virtual laboratory. We call it the virtual laboratory. This allows interactive learning by enabling the design of experiments and interpretation of results in a highly interactive, computer-based, multimedia environment. Let me take that one again. It allows for active learning by enabling the design of experiments and interpretation of results in a highly interactive, computer-based multimedia environment. So the virtual lab has been successfully used to increase science literacy by teaching basic concepts in biology, basic concepts in chemistry, basic concepts in physics, basic concepts in agriculture, and such other subjects. Multimedia has been applied in areas of scientific research, such as agriculture, microbiology, zoology, atomic physics, and so on. Application of multimedia to the teaching learning and research of the applied sciences is very beneficial because many concepts and processes in science are abstract and very difficult to understand. As we all know, abstract things are difficult to grasp most of the time, but with the multimedia, they become real. They come alive to the learner as they are. Excuse me. Topics that would otherwise have been boring and abstract or unimaginable can be made interesting and easy to understand through the use of simulations, graphics, audio, and animation. Of course, in addition to the text. Let's consider this example. A long-term research involving the demonstration of growth phases in the development of a new improved pest-resistant cocoa plant. That's I'm trying to get you up to speed there. I think we're around here. So we're around here. So the scenario I was painting is where you have research that should take a long process. For instance, the demonstration of the growth phases and the development of a new improved pest-resistant strain of maybe cocoa plant. That will take a long while, and all that. So you can, instead of sitting down there and watching every day, watching every minute, watching every time, instead of, you won't even be able to afford that time, you will have no luxury of time to that extent. So you won't be able to say you want to watch every day, every minute, every week as it grows and all that. But with simulation, that becomes very easy. So a combination of graphics, animation, audio, and video clips can be used to break through the constraints of time and space and demonstrate the growth process or the growth cycle of the cocoa plant. So you just simulate, and all of that through use of your graphics, your animation, your text, your audio, your video clips, and so on, to demonstrate that instead of watching it day by day or week by week. So with that, we come to application of multimedia in commerce. We've seen the application of multimedia in science and tech, application of multimedia in education, application of use of multimedia in library, and so on. But here we've come to application of multimedia in commerce. So this is also very important because commerce is essential. Everything is about making profits or getting money and all of that. So it is important to talk about this here. Look around you, for example, on the roads, anywhere around you. You will see clearly the colorful, catchy billboards advertising various products and services. As you will see, most of the time we see, but we don't see them. We pass by them, we don't look at them, we don't fancy them, we don't appreciate some of those things, but they are very essential and we must appreciate them. Must look at. So if you look around, you will see that there's nowhere you won't see that on the road, all around the campus, anywhere you turn to, on campus, you see such things. So advertising strategy involves the use of vivid colors, audio, video, and animation on television, the internet, radio, and billboards. So you hear, all sorts of adverts and jingles on TV, on radio, and all of that. And you see a lot on the internet. And then when you go around, you see many of them on billboards. So this is just to appeal to the consumer senses. The essence of all of that is to appeal to the consumer's senses, those who are to buy, those whom the products are meant for, to appeal to their senses, so that they can say, okay, oh, I love this, oh, I like this, oh, I will go for that, and so on. In order for consumers to purchase the products and services that are advertised. The use of text alone as advertising strategy will have less appeal, if at all, will have less appeal to the consumer than using multimedia with its many advantages. So the multimedia has a lot of advantages over the ordinary text, and that's why it is employed even in commerce and other social activities. So almost at the end of the class, it is also applicable in medicine. So that takes us to the last thing to say here: application of multimedia in medicine. Because of course, some of you will be familiar with that. In medicine, doctors can get trained by looking at a virtual surgery, or they can simulate how the human body is affected by diseases spread by viral and bacteria, and then develop techniques to prevent it. So that's all the things, majorly what the doctors or what the medical people do is summarized there. So you simulate, you can simulate, you want to know, the growth of a disease, anything, everything, you can see, you can simulate. You want to perform a surgery and all of that, you can simulate for people to, so you don't really have to go to where the surgeon is working in the hospital, because if you need to wait for that, you may not see most of what you are to see in training. So that is done in medicine. A lot of that applies in medicine. So multimedia applications such as virtual surgeries help doctors and other medical personnel get practical training. So we've talked about the definition of multimedia, and of course we already understand the context. The context here is the library. So multimedia use in the library and all of that, and because the library is all about information for everyone, for every learner, for even teachers, then it is applicable to everything in this context or in our environment. So we see the types, the concept itself, the use in the library, application in education, application in science and technology, application in commerce, application in medicine, and so on and so forth. So, but in conclusion, you can see that multimedia has a lot of advantages over text or the traditional methods of learning. So thank you very much for listening. Kò sí nǹkan kan tí mo tún máa ṣe mọ́.